Tonight on the Late Debate. Will the row over paper mile inflict any damage on the mayor in the final days of election campaigning?
As long as I'm mayor, there is no paper mile. Do not believe the lies, misinformation and disinformation the Tories are spreading. They're desperate.
Because there's an election, he's saying he's not going to do it. But if he was to get back into power after May the 2nd, he will bring in paper mile.
Also tonight, what will it take to win your vote? We examine a Tory plan to scale back free school meals. And more power to the mayor. Has the time come for greater devolution for London?
So we'll get better bangs for our bucks, we'll get better public services, and will also enable us to prioritise the spend on the things that can really shift the dial on jobs and growth in London.
Good evening. In 2 weeks' time, the polls will have closed and there will be nothing more London's mayoral candidates can do to win your vote for the top job at City Hall. Until then, it's all to play for. And this week, the gloves came off between the main parties with a special debate here on ITV London. Tory candidate Susan Hall stirred things up with claims of a secret plot to charge drivers based on how far they drive, something denied by Sadiq Khan.
Sadiq Khan says he's not going to bring in paper mile. But Sadiq Khan also said he would never bring in the ULEZ expansion. And look what happened there. And that has caused so much hardship for families that simply cannot afford to replace their cars. If they think that is bad enough, if we bring in paper mile, or if Sadiq Khan brings in paper mile, everybody will be paying.
Susan said that your next plan is paper mile. Is that true?
It is untrue. What I'm passionate about is continuing to improve public transport in London. London has benefited with a fares freeze in 5 of the last 8 years, the hopper fare, unlimited bus travel for an hour, and also with the tram, the cheapest bus fares in the country.
You said you want single fare across all transport. I mean, that's not cheap. So how are you planning on paying for it?
That's an ambition, and it's all about fairness. That's what our transport policy is all about. So it's all about bringing down the fares for outer Londoners, people that are paying. Some people have been pushed out into those outer boroughs and then having to travel further into work. So it's all about creating a system that's a lot fairer. Yes, it will be expensive. I'd have to negotiate with the government for that money. So we'd want to start looking at maybe the DLR first, but eventually getting a one fare like we do on the buses.
If the polls are to be believed, and if Labour are due to come in as our next national government, do you think that you'll be able to work well alongside them in terms of trying to get a fair amount of money for London?
The problem with Sadiq's policies, he's taken £1 billion out of transport for London. That's been cuts to buses, cuts to tube maintenance, so the tube has been breaking down more. But also, it's very hard to negotiate with national government if, whenever they give you money, you then give it away in an election gimmick. So I've said no more of these election gimmicks. We'll have stable finances, and that will allow us to negotiate a long-term funding settlement.
Yeah. Joining me now to continue that debate are my guests tonight, Labour MP for Streatham, Bel Ribeiro Addy; for the Conservatives, the MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, David Simmons; Liberal Democrat Assembly Member Caroline Pidgeon; and for the Green Party, Baroness Jenny Jones. Welcome all of you. Bel, first of all, on paper mile, the Labour Party has called upon the Crown Prosecution Service to investigate a Conservative election leaflet talking about paper mile. In the cut and thrust of a campaign, wasn't that a bit over the top?
No, I don't think so. If you look at the leaflet that they were putting out, it actually did scare a few people.
Isn't that the point of an election leaflet?
It is, but not one that's actually going to make people think they're having to pay something. In a time where we have a cost of living crisis and people will literally become anxious from having bills dropped through their door, something that looks as real as that and is promoting as much disinformation as that should be investigated. And at the end of the day, you know, they have to play fair in these elections. They've already changed the voting system in a hope to make it easier for the Tories to win at spreading disinformation as well. It's just not on.
David, why don't you believe the Mayor when he says in his manifesto, as he has done today, he will not introduce paper mile in the next 4 years?
Sadiq Khan has spent £21 million of London taxpayers' money preparing for paper mile. We know that in his recent book on this topic, he said paper mile is the next policy that he wants to implement in the capital. And his official spokesman said yesterday that it was on hold for now. And as Susan has highlighted, we know with the ULEZ expansion, which is a major issue amongst my constituents, particularly lower income people who are dependent on their cars, that was a very nasty surprise that the Mayor hadn't highlighted. And they're very concerned that paper mile, which would affect everybody in the capital, is going to be a similar nasty surprise
Caroline,
as well.
in your long term at City Hall, you spent a lot of time focusing on transport. What do you think the truth is about paper mile? Is it coming? Has Transport for London been working on it?
I think they have been working on it. They were working on it under Boris Johnson. It's been in both mayors' transport strategies. But actually, I think where Liberal Democrats differ is we think the mayor has rushed in the ULEZ expansion. He didn't bring people with him, which had happened in the earlier stages. So even if paper mile is something that could be a long-term ambition, it's not coming anytime soon because of how the mayor badly implemented the ULEZ expansion and didn't bring in enough scrappage scheme to help Londoners to meet this new requirement. So he has failed in that area, and I think that means paper mile is not coming anytime
Jenny,
soon.
paper mile is something the Green Party would support. Isn't it a bit short-sighted of the Mayor to abandon it now?
Look, the Greens are much more radical than any other party, but even we wouldn't actually try to implement paper mile. And we like actually making sure that our air is clean, and to do that you have to have a ULEZ system because it's the only way to reduce dirty cars. And what our mayoral candidate Zoe Garber is saying is that what we should do is help the people who are poor in the outer boroughs by actually making a much cheaper bus fare. It's what Ken Livingstone did when he brought the congestion charge in. And it was the first time on a bus back in 2003 or whatever that I'd ever seen anyone in a suit on a bus. People actually used the buses because they were cheap.
So can I just agree with Jenny? I mean, in my constituency where there are villages, there are farms, we see people who really need improvements in public transport, and what the Mayor has done is reduced the bus service. There is no tube, there is no overground, and that's why people are so concerned, because they've heard this message about paper mile. They're already facing the imposition of a congestion charge if they've taken the plunge and bought an electric car, which comes in next year. And now paper mile, given the amount the Mayor has already spent preparing for it, given the personal commitment to that policy that he set out, is a really genuine concern.
He said he's not going to bring in paper mile, so he's not
But
going
he
to
has
bring
been
in
an
paper mile.
enthusiast for it for the last year or so, hasn't he?
He said he's not going to do it, so he's not
But
going to do it. And I think
not for now.
the Greens are
That's what
right
he
to be
said.
concerned about the cost of transport, and I think that's been one of the key things that Sadiq has been working on. Freezing fares, as you heard him say, for a number of years, the hopper fare, all of these different measures that have been put in place to help people deal with the cost of living crisis.
Isn't paper mile ultimately a fairer way of charging motorists?
I mean, you could argue that, but ultimately it's toxic now because of how the Mayor went about expanding the ultra-low emission zone. But if you're going to bring in a policy, you need to give people a longer lead-in time, but you've got to invest in public transport. Under this Mayor, we have seen 10 million miles worth of bus miles cut across London at a time when you're trying to get people onto public transport. So I think he's just gone about it the wrong way, and actually means that any other way of pricing for using the road is just out of the window for decades to come.
I am personally absolutely disgusted with the way that the Tories have pushed this agenda. Clearly they are lying. They have been lying on lots of leaflets that they've been pushing out. That is disgraceful. And
David, is your party lying?
No, and I think, this is something which people are very concerned about, and they have a good reason to be. My constituents saw nothing in the last Labour manifesto from Sadiq Khan about the ULEZ expansion. We've seen 30 years of improving air quality in London. The evidence, including the Mayor's own technical report, said the ULEZ would make no difference to that. Now we see a Mayor who spent £21 million of taxpayers' money preparing for this policy, set out his personal commitment to it. Suddenly, as we saw in the Uxbridge by-election with the local police station, for 7 years that Mayor had said, I am going to close that police station. When it became an election issue, he suddenly U-turned, and this has very much the same feel about it.
can I just point out we've got a stinking, awful Conservative government that's constantly doing U-turns. Don't accuse somebody else of doing exactly what you guys are doing.
And let us not remember that Londoners have been punished quite specifically for having a Labour mayor.
Yes.
So many cuts to funding going into London. And actually, I think about what happened during the pandemic and how many things that the government, did not keep their promise on in terms of funding. London had to survive by itself. And I think Sadiq has done a fantastic job at pulling us through those difficult years and keeping us going. And even with that loss of central funding, we've been able to do fantastic things like bring in free school meals for children and actually make them permanent.
Let's talk about free school meals, because today Sadiq Khan launched his manifesto, and in it he promised to continue his free school meals scheme until the end of the next 4 years at City Hall. And that opened up a very clear dividing line with his Conservative opponents.
Somebody with one child has saved £1,000 over the course of the 2 years. We know 300,000 families with children have benefited. It's really important at a time when families are facing a cost of living crisis to support them.
I've agreed to keep it on for this extra year because the money is in place, and then we'll take a view in a year's time. Don't forget, I will also be helping people with the cost of living by taking away the ULEZ expansion on day one.
David, has Susan Hall shot herself in the foot by saying that she's going to review free school meals? It's a very popular policy.
Well, the government's been very clear in its financial support to the capital. It will bail out things like, as it has in the past, the cost of COVID. All of the costs that London faced were covered by central government grant. What we're not going to cover is the cost of car. Now, clearly, Susan needs to make a judgment. Now, we've seen the action central government has taken with the reduction in things like national insurance, which will save the average working family £900 a year already, significantly more in the capital where wages are higher. And I think it's right that Susan has said, we'll extend this for another 12 months, whilst we know that those cost of living pressures are very salient. But with the reductions in inflation, with the fact that 2 years on the run now, wage growth has outstripped inflation. The capital is a place where it's relatively easy to find work, to increase your hours if you're needing work, that wages are rising rapidly. Then we need to look at, is that the right decision for that taxpayers' money, or are there more important things to do with it?
Why would you be against extending free school meals for children permanently? Why? I really don't understand that. And also, bringing ULEZ, yes, it was definitely a very difficult decision, and I understand all of the concerns around it, but it seems your Conservative candidate doesn't really understand how it works, because does she understand just how much money it would cost to scrap it on day one? And where would she get the money from?
Well, Susan has been very clear. She's a councillor in my constituency. She's been a great colleague, and she did a fantastic job turning around Harrow Council, including making sure its finances were stable.
She's made a very clear statement. Has she ever scrapped a ULEZ scheme, and does she understand how much it's going to cost?
I think we've got pretty clear figures on that. We know how much was spent on the cameras. She's set out very clearly in her budget proposals how she'd repurpose that, what those would be used for in terms of increasing security in the capital, which is a major concern, especially in the
change the ULEZ scheme.
Back to free school meals, which is what the question was about.
This policy of Sadiq Khan's is going to cost in excess of £500 million. That would pay for the repair of Hammersmith Bridge twice over. Would it be better spent there? The Lib Dems have been pushing for Hammersmith Bridge.
We absolutely have been. I actually really support free school meals, and we have, as a national party, we pushed for it and got it into infant schools when in government. But actually, this is something the government should be funding, and not just in London, it should be right across the country. And what I would like to see is City Hall looking at targeted breakfast clubs and issues like that, because we have seen children coming to school with empty stomachs and not able to fulfil their potential in classes. So actually, whilst the Mayor has put this forward, we have supported it as Liberal Democrats at City Hall. I would like to see central government putting this money in.
Jenny, your candidate, Zoe Garbutt, wants to extend it to secondary schools. That's going to cost a lot of money. Where's that money coming from?
Well, we've got a fully costed manifesto, which I'm not sure that everybody has. And we would find the money for it. But it's an incredibly important thing. It's not only about feeding children and making sure that they can actually study properly and achieve. It's also about the whole egalitarian feel that if you are on free school meals, you are just the same as somebody who comes from a much richer family. When I was a child back in the 1950s, everybody had free school meals, and so you weren't aware of differential in well-being and so on. I just think it's cruel to take it away, and it is typical of this government.
OK, well, whoever gets the job of London Mayor will have their work cut out with a £21 billion budget to spend. But some argue it's not enough. More devolution would mean London keeps and spends more of the tax raised here to pay for things like new tube trains and rely less on financial handouts from the government.
So London generates a tax surplus of getting on for £40 billion a year. And it's quite right, as one of the richer regions of the country, some of that money should be spent on general public services elsewhere. But what is just bonkers is that generating that kind of tax surplus from one of the most vibrant economies in the world, London government has to go cap in hand to central government if it needs to replace some tube trains.
Well, probably the best way would be to allow London access to more of the taxes that are set here, as happens in Scotland and Wales, by the way. You'd offset that by cutting central government grants to London, but London would control more of the money that is raised here and therefore use it in a way that made sense in London rather than national government spending money on London just as part of spending from John O'Groats to Land's End.
David, Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, was an enthusiast for devolution. What's the government's objection?
Well, I'm an enthusiast for devolution as well, but I think if we look at what's happened with the mayoralty, Sadiq Khan has increased his precept 71%. If we make the comparison with Andy Street, who's a Conservative mayor in the West Midlands, he doesn't have a mayoral precept at all. So the work that he's done to drive forward job creation, economic development in his area, he's done without hitting taxpayers in the pocket. So we need to make sure that we have a situation where we have an effective and mature city government. And I'm amenable to many of the ideas about the devolution of taxes and making sure that maybe things like stamp duty, tourist taxes, a greater share of business rates could be kept in the capital. There's lots of different ways in which this could be done. But we need to make sure that that money is being spent responsibly. And we must remember, this is a mayor who was given money by central government to recruit more police officers and was the only police and crime commissioner in the whole country who gave it back because he couldn't meet that objective. That isn't something that inspires confidence that they will do it.
Issue.
And I think completely.
In terms of devolution, which is the real issue here, it's absolutely crucial. If we really want to empower communities, you've got to give more power to the Mayor of London and the London Assembly, and that has to include fiscal devolution. You've got to be able to give people the money to be able to pull the levers to actually find services that really work for our city and to invest in the infrastructure going forward. We've got no Crossrail coming up. We've got no Bakerloo line extension. There are no big transport projects down the line. Partly because this mayor has not negotiated well with government, but partly because we haven't got the financial levers as well. And it's so important, whoever is in government later this year, whoever becomes mayor of London, that they negotiate well and that we have this real devolution to our great cities.
Caroline makes a point there that Sadiq Khan hasn't had a good relationship with the government. He said at the last election after winning he would build bridges, but he hasn't been particularly friendly towards the government and hasn't got out of his way to make friends with them, has he?
Why should he have to go out of his way to make friends with them? He's negotiating on behalf of the people of the capital. The government have responsibility for the people in this capital as much as they do for everybody else across the country. But they've chosen to punish Londoners. London is it's our capital city. We have a situation that's quite unique in terms of, how many people are coming here, tourists, etc., the amount of transport we need, the protection, all of those different things. And the government, instead of funding London in the way it should, has continued to punish Londoners. And I don't think it's right for you to say that the mayor has misspent the money in any way. I think that's really, really wrong. I think that's completely untrue. And also, you have to think about the fact that we in this city generate a lot of the economy as well. That eventually ends up going up to other places in the country. I think that's important. It should, but we should be able to have that level of control.
So would Rachel Reeves, if she was the next Chancellor, let Sadiq Khan have a greater take of the tax revenues from London?
Well, I hope that she would. And I think that what Sadiq Khan has proved by managing the completely inappropriate budget that the government has given him is what he can do with what he's been given. And I think that's really, really important, showing that he can show that leadership and make those financial decisions, even in the face of being done hard by the Tories.
Jenny, can I just ask you, you were at City Hall when Boris Johnson was mayor with 2 years of a Labour government. You were there when Ken Livingstone was mayor, when he was an independent and not seeing eye to eye at all with Tony Blair's new Labour government. Did they have a different way of managing their relationships with the government than Sadiq Khan does?
Well, I think Ken Livingstone did, he was able, I think, to make the case for London, but there was more money washing around in any case. The real problem with Boris Johnson was he's actually set the scene for all the damage that's happened to London. He, for example, cut the police by some incredible amount. Was it 20,000 or something? He encouraged the police selling off all the police housing. So police officers, that's partly why you can't recruit police officers in London, because they have to live so far out. So Boris Johnson actually set the scene for all the failures, subsequent failures. And I don't think anyone could have a worse relationship or a better relationship with the government that we've got. It's decomposing. Time to move on, time for a general election, and I'm really looking
David,
forward
what's
to
your
it.
take on Sadiq Khan's relationship with ministers?
So the government's learnt in its dealings with Sadiq Khan that, unlike many of the other mayors, and I think of people like Andy Burnham, Tracy Brabin, Steve Rotherham, that they can't trust
all Labour mayors.
This is a Labour mayor who will walk into the room, will agree with government that this bailout of hundreds of millions of pounds covers all the costs that have been dealt with as a result of COVID, and will then walk out the door and say, the government have done me over, knowing that that's not what he said to ministers behind closed doors.
I also
That's been a repeated
actually-
pattern of
but
behaviour.
actually
We
just
need to
said
be able
that
to
he
trust
gave-
this mayor. My constituents have learnt with ULEZ, they can't trust him. He doesn't put it in his manifesto and then he hits them in the pocket, and the risk at this election is Paper Mile will do exactly that if he's re-elected.
Can I just say it's very difficult if you negotiate a settlement with government and then you're seen to have gimmicks, giving away freezes on fares and so on. That doesn't feel responsible. Neither of these are my parties, but surely just looking from outside, that's not professional, that's not responsible. And I don't think that's how a good mayor of London should operate in negotiating with any other authority.
I wouldn't refer to them as gimmicks when they are effectively helping people with the cost of living crisis. And actually, you made a point earlier about the government, the mayor giving back 63 million in terms of recruitment. The government asked for that back. The commissioner asked to keep it, as did the mayor, and the government asked for the money back.
Well, they asked for it back because he couldn't meet his objectives. The deal was here's money for police officers, and he didn't do it. So quite understandably, they said other commissioners around the country,
do you
they're
see what
doing
I mean?
their job better
Again,
than you are.
About
They deserve that money.
About misinformation. Don't say that
But that's
he
true.
gave
I mean,
the
that's
money
a
back.
fact.
No, it's not a fact. Don't say that he
Jenny,
gave the money
you're
back when it
huffing
was
there.
given.
Well, I'm huffing and puffing because this is a clear example of why the Mayor of London ought to have more money, ought to have a purse that person, he or she, can spend themselves in the way that Londoners want them to spend it.
He does have £21 billion.
And I think moving forward, we need more power for the Mayor, more money for the Mayor, but also for the London Assembly. The London Assembly has to hold the Mayor to account. And so I'm all for giving them more money.
I think that's one thing we all agree on.
Yeah.
And Caroline, presumably on transport, you think the mayor should have control of some of the commuter railway lines?
Oh, it's so obvious. You've seen the success of the London Overground right across London. You know, I'm really convinced taking over the suburban rail services will deliver a better service for Londoners and something that's more joined up. It's something the Liberal Democrats have supported for many years, and cross-party on the Assembly we have supported. Unfortunately, it's come to a block in the last 8 years or so with the current government. But it's really important we have that. It's really important we find ways to invest in transport across the city, whether it's Crossrail 2 or other projects too.
Can I just say, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming in colour-coded in red, blue, yellow and green. Before we go, here's a list of the candidates standing to be Mayor of London on your screens now. The election takes place on Thursday, May the 2nd. And that's all for tonight. Thank you to all my guests, Bel Ribeiro-Addy, David Simmons, Caroline Pidgeon and Jenny Jones. We'll be back next month. Until then, good night and thank you for watching.